Hello, BookTube. I'm continuing on today with the read-along that I'm doing along with David Murphy. I'll leave a link to his channel below. We're reading God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. And we're doing it in an unconventional way. We are reading it a chapter a day until we run out of chapters. We're not really conferring with each other, so I don't really know what David's going to say on any chapter until I watch his video on that chapter. But today is another example of a chapter in this book that is going to be fairly easy to predict. I doubt that he's going to get to 30 minutes. I'm certainly not going to get to 30 minutes. I know I always say I'm not going to get to 30 minutes, and then I do. But in this case, the chapter that we're reading today is chapter 12. And it is a coda, How Religions End. And it's 6 paragraphs long. I believe it's the shortest chapter in the book. And we dealt last time, Hitchens did a chapter on how religions begin, in which he doesn't deal in any kind of a sweeping or meta way. Instead, he looks at 3 different religious movements and how they began. And they aren't big ones. They're 3 recent and relatively smaller scale ones than, for instance, if you looked at how some of the world's huge religions began. And this chapter, chapter 12, is... he calls it a coda, How Religions End, but he doesn't deal with that at all. He deals with the lifespan of one particular religious movement, and could easily this entire chapter could easily have been boiled down to 3 sentences and put in a footnote of the previous chapter. Easily. The only reason it's here as a standalone chapter on its own is because it's one example among many that you can find in this book of Christopher Hitchens straining to make it book length. I'm sure that his agent, or maybe prospective publishers, including some who passed on this book and wish they hadn't, I'm sure that they were looking at his original notes or his original verbal descriptions and saying, well, okay, but it has to be at least 3 times longer than the last few pamphlets that you have written. We can't bring it out as a major hardcover and put it forward for contention on the New York Times bestseller list if it isn't an actual book. And I think this and the chapter on Why Heaven Hates Ham and a couple of other bits in this book are a clear example of Hitchens just pumping air into this thing, of trying to give it a chapter count, a page count that would warrant it being considered an actual book instead of the pamphlets that he usually wrote, the tiny 100-page things that he usually wrote. And this whole chapter, the title is How Religions End, but really this is about one religious movement and one religious figure, Sabbatai Tzvi, who was a revivalist preacher in the 17th century. He only lived until he was 50, I think. He didn't live to a great old age. But he, in the prime of his life, at age 40, he was attracting enormous crowds. He was a charismatic speaker who interpreted the Kabbalah and the Jewish and Christian scriptures as a way of, in a familiar pattern that charismatic, massive crowd speakers usually do, which is to hit the oldies but the goodies, to hit the golden oldies of, you must repent. The way to paradise is open to you, but it relies on you changing your ways. You are not worthy, and you must become worthy. We see that pattern over and over and over again, not only in huge religious figures like Apollonius of Tyana or something like that, but also in the huge religious movement exactly of this nature that was going on in Bronze Age Palestine and that was then folded into an even bigger movement. Of course, I'm talking about John the Baptist, who the idea that John the Baptist was attracting massive crowds all throughout Judea and baptizing them and telling them that the word was alive and that they must be baptized and born again into a new faith. The idea that such a person tacked on to his massive ministry a coda at every single watering hole and village stop, that he's actually not the guy you're looking for, that the guy you're looking for is coming right behind me, that I am his messenger, I think it's obvious retrofitting. Obvious. You have to keep in mind the Christian church, the Christian religion, had control not only of its own narrative, but of all narratives. It had control of books forever and ever. I think what you see clearly in the Christian New Testament is one messianic movement being folded into another, probably because John the Baptist movement was so big and so widespread and so well known that you couldn't just ignore it. You couldn't just say, well, never mind about that. So that was folded into the larger narrative of an even more widespread populist, revivalist, you must be born again in order to achieve immortality type of Palestine preacher. And Jesus, of course, was not the last of those. There were dozens and dozens of others that we have better recorded records of it than anything approaching what we have for Jesus or John the Baptist. No one talks about them because, again, Christianity controls the books. It controls its own narrative. But there were many, many people, less than a generation after Jesus. There were many such figures who attracted enormous crowds and who claimed they were either chosen of God to speak to the multitudes or the chosen of God, claimed they were the Messiah. And that claim was made about Sabbatai Tzvi only in the 17th century. He also attracted huge crowds wherever he went. He also attracted divine narratives and gospels and apostles and prophets and people who said, I am preparing the way for he who, whose sandal I am not fit to unloose. And it all happened much closer to the present day, and Sabbatai Tzvi is the subject, the sole subject of this book. Hitchens, of course, his story is going to gladden the heart of a contrarian and an atheist like Hitchens, because when Sabbatai Tzvi's massive preaching became known to the officials of the Ottoman Empire, they hauled him in and gave him a choice between being tortured to death or converting to Islam. And he did. He converted to Islam. And I had an old friend who was a fire and brimstone atheist. Just fire and brimstone. You think anything negative that I'm saying in these videos is bad? Oh my. Oh my. He was much, much worse. And he used to go on about Sabbatai Tzvi all the time. And there are a few... One of the things you notice about the crop of... I want to say YouTube-friendly new atheists. A lot of them are young. Some of them aren't. But one thing you notice about most of them is how poorly read they are. They can rattle off 1,500 logical fallacies. They can do that at light speed. So you say, hi, my name is, and they say, logical fallacy. Like that's some sort of get-out-of-jail-free card. Like that's kryptonite. Like you can't make sense. It has become logical fallacies. The list of logical fallacies, their formal names, has become just a sing-song mantra amongst a lot of these people. And a lot of them are young and will probably grow out of that. But the one thing I noticed when I watched them, I used to watch a lot more. I can't really bear it. I can't really bear it to watch much of it now on YouTube. Christianity is too important and big a subject to be poorly criticized. Especially if, as is the case in virtually every new atheists that I have watched, even the ones who claim they're not, especially if you're going to claim while you're criticizing it that it's never done anything praiseworthy. That's tough to watch. That really is. And it's even tougher when it's an unshaven 20-something who doesn't know anything about evangelical history, doesn't know anything about religious movements, doesn't know anything about the original documents that he is condemning. And most of these people don't know anything about Sabbatai Tzvi, and they've never done any serious thinking about why his case study may be important or may not. One of them, one figure that I can think of off the top of my head, who is extremely well versed in all this stuff, is Bob Price, who is closer to my age, and who knows all about this figure and has talked about him. And the joy for Sabbatai Tzvi, for a figure like Christopher Hitchens, is the final grace note. It's not that he amassed massive crowds. It's not that he did it in exactly the same way that all previous messianic cult movements have done, including the one that took. The one that took because its religious dogma was wedded to the instrumentality of the state and the military by a Roman emperor who said, these two things are now connected, where they hadn't been. And if that Roman emperor, if Constantine the Great, hadn't done that, I don't know that we'd still be talking about Christianity as anything more than a local, an extremely local, geographically local religious movement that still had adherents. Certainly, at his highlight, in his heyday, the followers of Sabbatai Tzvi were 100% sure that they were dealing with and going to see the Messiah. And so, of course, for Hitchens and people like him, the irresistible grace note of the whole story is its ending. That Sabbatai Tzvi wasn't put to death. He converted to Islam to save his own skin. He continued to be an annoyance for the Ottoman Empire. Hitchens mentions that he was banished. But that doesn't really do justice to all the hijinks that followed his conversion. It's a pretty interesting story, and it's a more complex story than the version that Hitchens gives. Hitchens is mainly concerned with the ignominy of this. He could easily have picked, when he's talking about how religions end, he could easily have picked other endings. It's just that, as is the case with Sabbatai Sevi, I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head. I'm trying to remember if there are any Sabbataians left in the world. Anywhere in the world. I don't know that there are. In the 21st century, I'm not sure that there are any left. They may have just died out. But that's not usually the way that religions end. Usually religions end on the point of a sword. That's why there are no adherents of ancient Egyptian religion anymore. That's not just mythology. That's not Horus and Osiris and Isis. That was an active religion believed in passionately by millions of people. And it was extirpated. It didn't die a natural death. It was extirpated. Same thing famously with the cult of Mithras, which could easily have been the religion that we deal with today. It could easily be the world-girdling religion, the one against which all others are measured. If a Roman emperor had said, instead of the cross, you are going to take up the cape and the horns. You're going to take up the cult of Mithras. That is going to be our state religion. And you can't progress in civil service. You can't get a job. You can't join the military. You can't join the royal family. And you're subject to random pogroms if you don't confess that faith and bring your children up in it. If a Roman emperor had said that about the cult of Mithras, that's what we're talking about now. And not Christianity. And that's usually the way that religions end, and that is not in this chapter. The chapter is how religions end, but it's just one movement. It's just one figure who blazed across the European stage for 10 years and then converted to Islam and gradually petered out. Hitchens doesn't spend any time on the fact that people were Sabbataians for centuries after Sabbatai Tzvi died. He doesn't pay any attention to that. That is a lifespan of a religion. If you're talking about these things as Dan Dennett often does in evolutionary biological terms, that is a successful organism. And Hitchens doesn't talk about that at all. Instead, he makes this seem like a flash in the pan. That siren's just sort of popping up and down the street. No hurry. I'm not speeding. I'm not even running through the red light. I'm just playing my fun siren. Anyway, that's our chapter for today, is this coda, this 6-paragraph coda on how religions end. It doesn't teach us anything about how religions end. It isn't Hitchens going into that at all. It's basically just a digression on one religious figure, an admittedly interesting religious figure, but still. It doesn't go into anything in detail of what Sabbatai Tzvi ever said. It doesn't go into any writings that are connected with him. It's just the epiphenomenon, that's all. And that does it for this chapter. It's fairly light. So I find it hard to believe that David will go on forever about it. Well, we shall see. Our next chapter, though, has a lot of thought behind it and generates a lot of conversation. Sabbatai Tzvi can't generate much conversation. But the next chapter, chapter 13, is, does religion make people behave better? And that is an absolutely fundamental, age-old question, and also one of the first apologetics that Christians defending their faith revert to every time. There are many new atheists who will say that even if they don't go to this one originally, they'll end up there, that Christianity is the basis of morality, an objective basis of morality, that it does, in fact, make people behave better, self-evidently. There's even a lying Dennis Prager video to that effect, that if unless God says that murder is wrong, murder isn't wrong. We don't have to talk about Dennis Prager. But that is our next chapter of God is Not Great. And it's a much different thing than an obvious footnote that was just blown up and made into a chapter because the book was going to be too short. So we can dispense with that fairly quickly, and we'll go on to the next chapter tomorrow. That'll be a lot more fun to talk about. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.